Camden, since you're standing up. What do we have this week?
Quiz with R. That's what I've heard on the word on the street.
Friday, test next Tuesday.
That's so bad.
KBAS due Wednesday.
Reading due tonight.
Okay. Quiz on Friday, test, I think it's Tuesday or so, Wednesday maybe next week. Okay?
Can I take my test online?
Can you take your test online?
I mean my quiz.
It's a hard copy, I know track, but it's a hard copy.
Do we have any calendars back? Oh, yeah.
Yes, you do. Okay, so, last week, we did an overview of the Cold War.
What chapter?
28.
Last week, we did an overview of the Cold War, right? And we talked about the different periods of the Cold War. Okay? What we're going to do today is start working our way through the details, particularly of the origins, containment, and confrontation. So that's where we're going in the next few slides, is talking about that. Now, what kind of shape, Buck, was Europe in at the end of World War II?
Bad shape.
Bad shape, how so?
Oh, it was pretty torn up.
Okay. So what are things that armies had destroyed in the war?
Churches.
Churches, though not necessarily intentionally. All right, factories. Would factories be targets?
Yep.
How about airports?
Yeah.
Airports would be targets, right, that you would like to destroy those. What about bridges? Yes. Roads? Okay. All right. So physically, Europe is in ruins, right? And this is true, perhaps not everywhere in Europe, but it's true in most of Europe, right? Because the armies have gone back and forth over most of Europe. Okay? So it's different from World War I. Because in World War I, the destruction was fairly limited. It was devastating, right, in where it was, but it was fairly limited in where it was. This is very widespread. This is impacting every country. Okay? So physically, there's got to be huge amounts of building for the economies to come back. Yes, because you just can't move goods without the roads and the bridges and all of those types of things. Okay? Now, another factor. The most recent historical estimates by historians of how many people died. The numbers usually that historians come up with are somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million. 50 million. So what does that mean, Caroline, for anybody in Europe? Okay? All right, but it means that everybody has lost somebody they knew, right? Perhaps their entire family or much of their family, right? But everybody has been impacted. Okay? Another problem is that all the fighting has destroyed lots of homes. This would especially be true in cities, right? Probably less true in rural areas, more true in cities, that you have lots and lots of people who are homeless because their homes have been destroyed. Okay? Estimates here would be in the tens of millions of people who are homeless. Then you have displaced persons. Displaced persons. Now, what is a DP, Mr. May, or a displaced person?
Like someone who's not where they like used to be, like they're lost in their family or something. Like, cause they went to like a camp and they don't know, they can't get back where they were.
Okay, they're people who are separated from their families. They have, perhaps are in a different country, right? I mean, just a very simple aspect of that would be Holocaust survivors, right? Because they may have been from Poland or somewhere, and now when they're liberated from their camp, they're in Germany, right? So you have lots and lots of people who don't have family ties, they don't have homes, they don't have jobs. Okay? So World War II is a great example of dislocation that has come from war. That's always been true of war, yes? It's always been true of war. The difference is the war was almost everywhere in Europe, right? So instead of pockets of Europe where there was fighting and destruction and people were displaced, now it's all over the continent. Even in a place like Britain. Even in a place like Britain where Britain didn't get invaded, right? It got bombed in the Battle of Britain, but it didn't get invaded. Okay? But there are people in Britain who came from the continent, and there are people in Britain who are homeless because their homes got destroyed in the bombing. Okay? So any kinds of attempts to rebuild Europe are going to require massive amounts of effort to rebuild. Next point I want to make before I go on. If you've got people who were from Poland, but now they're in Germany, or they were from Poland, now they're in Czechoslovakia, what does that promote? Is it going to promote nationalism? It's probably going to promote a lot more of cooperation across national boundaries. So one of the themes that we're going to see in this chapter is growing economic, in some ways military, in lesser ways political cooperation between countries. Now, an example of this is the UN, United Nations, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Okay, that's a big term. This is a program established by the United Nations, and basically it is attempting to provide the needs of the displaced persons. That is, people who don't have homes, they're separated from their families, etc. It's an attempt to provide them with shelter, with food, clothing, the necessities of life. Now, who's running this? Not necessarily a person, but
League of Nations.
well, it's not the League of Nations now, it's the United Nations, which is like the League of Nations, designed to be a place where nations come together to cooperate to improve the standard of living, to improve the situation for people regardless of country. Okay? What's something that maybe you talked about last year in United history that might have played a similar role? Maybe at the end of the Civil War. Okay, how about the Freedmen's Bureau? Freedmen's Bureau was designed to do what? To provide housing, food, shelter for former slaves who are displaced people, aren't they? Right? I mean, some of that's good, right? They're not slaves anymore, but it also means they don't have a home. They don't have a place to live. They may be separated. Slave trade may have separated them from their families, right? So it's kind of a similar kind of attempt to provide care for people. Now, what about people who are displaced from the Soviet Union? What about maybe people who are displaced from Germany and they're in the Soviet Union? How are they going to be treated, Zach?
Not very well.
Okay, so the Soviets are not going to welcome people who have been displaced to other countries back home, right? And what about people who got displaced into Soviet-occupied territory?
They're gonna be persecuted.
Okay, they're not going to be welcomed back in the West, right? Okay? Especially in the Soviet Union, displaced persons, if they return to the Soviet Union, will be maybe facing prison terms. They may be exiled to labor camps, or they may actually just be executed because the Soviets feel they can't trust them. Why not, Jackson? Why would the Soviets feel they can't trust people who have been, let's say, in Germany?
Because they were told that communists were bad and they shouldn't believe in any administration that says otherwise.
Okay, and by the same token, if they have been displaced into the Soviet Union, there might be concerns that they have been converted. to being communist. Okay? So that's a huge problem that exists at the end of the war. Now, one group who won't necessarily be returned to their homes will be Jewish victims, particularly those who have been in the Holocaust, been in the concentration camps in Germany during the Holocaust. Now, one, the Jewish people would have had most of their families die, right? They would be frequently separated if there is any of their family still alive. Okay? And where did a lot of the Jews who were put in camps in Germany come from? Poland and the Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Okay? Now, many of these victims of the Holocaust will be put in special camps in Germany rather than being returned home. Now, this plays a role in the creation of Israel. Okay, talk to me about the creation of Israel, Mr. May. I'm guessing Mr. May is a little behind on the reading.
Like, it was, I know it's like a haven for Jews.
First, how dare
Like,
you, no.
They gave them, they had them go back to the promised land.
Okay. Now, Palestine, which would have been the Jewish homeland in biblical times, yes, had been a colony or a League of Nations mandate of what country in the interwar period?
Germany?
Britain. Britain had Palestine as a League of Nations mandate. We talked about this back in World War I. Supposedly, at least according to Jewish people, the Balfour Declaration or the Balfour Note had promised Palestine to Jews as a homeland. Yes. But in the treaties with Arabs, to get the Arabs to fight with the British against the Turks in World War I, Arabs were promised an Arab homeland. More than 80% of the people living in Palestine in 1918 were Arab. Okay? Now, Britain will allow the creation of an Arab state and an Israeli or a Jewish state, what becomes Israel, in what used to be Palestine in 1948. What's one of the reasons for this creation of a Jewish homeland and Israel?
Having to get them out of Europe, so something like the Holocaust could never happen again.
Okay, so it is a response to the Holocaust, right? Now, Who's living in Palestine?
Arabs.
A large number of Arabs. Okay? What's going to happen to Arabs in territory that is given to Israel?
We have,
They're gonna be made not welcome, right? Which is going to create a large number of displaced Arabs. Okay? The Arab-Israeli conflict. This is where it comes from. This is where it comes from. Okay? Over 1 million Arabs will be pushed out of Israel. Okay? As the Jews come in. All right, so on the one hand, you have the creation of a homeland for European Jews. On the other hand, in doing so, you're creating more displaced people in Palestine. Okay, now, at the end of World War II, during the wartime conferences, Germany, and Austria for that matter, will be divided into 4 occupation zones. Who has these 4 occupation zones? What countries?
US,
You.
Britain, France, and Russia.
And the USSR or the Soviet Union. Okay? Now, this was done for a couple reasons. One reason to set up these occupation zones is what?
Germany and Austria under control.
Okay? So it's a way to end the war and to agree upon who's going to occupy, begin to really rehabilitate each part of the country. Right? If there's no agreement on where the boundaries are, right, then armies it might get mixed up, right, on what they liberate, what they don't liberate, where the armies are, and setting up control. Now, were these occupation zones intended to be permanent? No, they were intended to be temporary. Will some of them become permanent?
Yes.
Yes, they will. And that's a product of Cold War. Now, one of the things in the Atlantic Charter that the Allies had talked about at the beginning of the war was to not expect reparation payments at the end of the war, like they did in World War I. Because what did they realize had happened from those reparation payments?
Germany went like extremely into debt.
Okay?
And
And
it kind of ruined the economy for them for a
It
while.
caused another war.
There was a whole depression.
okay? Did it encourage the rise of a radical, right-wing dictator,
Yes.
Hitler, who helps to bring about another war? Okay? Now, Britain, France, United States will not ask for reparations, but the Soviet Union will. The Soviet Union will. and they will extract their reparation payments from countries that fought with the Germans against them. And specifically, that's going to include East Germany, Hungary, and Romania. Do these lands have cash? And do they have money at the end of the war? No. So how can the Soviet Union get things of value?
Gaining other countries.
Well, trade, but if you trade, are you really getting reparations in that regard? No. So they're just going to take things. They will literally dismantle some factories. Not the frame of the building, but the machinery, and carry it back to the Soviet Union. They'll take agricultural products, take it back to the Soviet Union. Okay? Trying to help rebuild their economy at the expense of particularly these three countries who had fought against the Soviet Union in World War II. The Soviets in East Germany will even take up railroad tracks and take the rails back to the Soviet Union to repair railroads that were destroyed in the war. Okay, let's pause for a second before I go on. What's that going to do to the economies of East Germany, Hungary, and Romania? What, Alan?
They're gonna kind of fail, maybe go into depression.
They're going to be even more devastated, right? Because there are even some things that were destroyed are now going to be taken apart and hauled back to the Soviet Union. Okay? Where I'm going with this is I'm trying to set up the East German economy. As we go through the Cold War, leading up to the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which Soviet satellite's economy will be at the bottom of Eastern Europe?
East Germany.
East Germany. They will never build back up. And in fact, when Germany is reunited in '92, when Germany is put back together, the East Germans will have to be heavily subsidized by the West Germans because their economy, their infrastructure remains in very bad condition. Okay? Now, let's talk about war crimes. What are war crimes, Libby?
Crimes during the war. I don't know.
Crimes during the war, okay. All right.
It's like if you like break, rules of engagement or like, when you set up certain boundaries and then you cross boundaries.
Okay. So this could be from mass executions. It could be from destruction of things. It could be exploitation of certain peoples, right? Carrying out the Holocaust would be an example of things that would be considered a war crime. Okay? Now, roughly about 100,000 Germans, some Austrians, are gonna be convicted of war crimes. This will be done by the victorious allies that will set up a system where to try war criminals.
Nuremberg.
Nuremberg. Why will the governments, and we talked about trying war criminals very much in the past.
No.
No, never really talked about that in previous wars, right? I mean, one could argue that Napoleon was treated as a war criminal after the Napoleonic Wars, right? But generally speaking, we haven't seen a lot of war crimes, certainly not to this number. Why do we have these war crime trials after World War II?
Holocaust.
Okay, one reason is the Holocaust.
So promote like democracy to all of the countries in Europe.
Okay, both of those statements are true. It's another factor. To stop vigilantes. To stop vigilante justice. What's a vigilante, Caroline?
Isn't that like, I don't know.
Okay, Walton, what's a vigilante?
The only thing they're like heroes or whatever.
Okay, that's not wrong. It's not the whole story, but it's not wrong. What?
They could be bad people.
Okay,
It's like someone who goes out and tries to bring justice,
Yeah.
what they think is justice by like taking out like who they think are like bad people.
okay. So it's individuals or groups of individuals not acting through a structure or government exacting revenge. Now, the revenge could be on Germans. It could also be on people who collaborated with Germans. Okay? Think about France for just a minute. How long did Germany occupy most of France?
Like since like 1940 on.
Okay, so 1940 until at least 1944, right? End of 44, early 45. So 4 or 5 years. What would happen to French people living in occupied Germany for 4+ years? Would some people work with the Germans?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would maybe French women marry some of the Germans? Okay, all right. How would a collaborationist be treated by the Germans? Would they be treated better than the average French person? Yeah. Okay. So part of this is designed to prevent vigilante justice that might target not only the Germans that might be captured in other lands, but more likely the collaborationists. Okay? All right? Questions so far? Now, what is denazification? Mr. Hilson, what is denazification?
Probably Germany stripping down like Nazi statues and symbols around Germany that represent Nazi ideals.
Okay. So buildings and symbols, yes. What about people?
I guess removing Nazis from office and like political parties.
Okay.
Getting rid of like any, like Nazi information, like books and magazines and stuff like that.
Okay. Would it also be an attempt to blame the Nazi Party for all of the atrocities of the war? Yes. Okay. So basically, you're painting anything that was promoted by the Nazis as bad and trying to eliminate it from society, which would include actual people who were members of the Nazi Party. These would particularly be targeted at the Nuremberg trials. We mentioned that a minute ago. An international military tribunal was set up at Nuremberg, and they were charged with trying and sentencing high-ranking Nazi individuals who survived the war. Now, some of them got long-term prison terms. Most of the leaders were executed. Okay? And so, this is an attempt to blame the atrocities on them and punish them for it. Now, how does the Cold War fit into this equation? Camden, how does the Cold War fit into this denazification?
The Cold War made thorough denazification impractical.
Okay, why so? As you read the PowerPoint.
Does it go to the next one? Is the next one helpful for this?
Somewhat.
Well, 45,000 former Nazis were sentenced to death.
Okay. Okay, who's being targeted in these crimes, in these war crime trials? Who's being targeted? All right, Nazis, but who?
Germans.
All right, German Nazis,
Like officials,
yes.
Like people, like high-ranking.
Military leaders and stuff.
Military leaders, maybe government officials, maybe economists who work for the government. You're beginning to see a theme, right? If you kill all of these people, who do you have to lead Germany after the war?
Nobody really.
Okay? All of the previous leadership would be gone. Okay? So one of the things that maybe limits this is that you would be creating a power vacuum at the top if you really eliminated all the Nazis. And so at least some of the Nazis who are willing to work with, collaborate with either the Allies, British, French, Americans in the West, or the Soviets in the East, might be found to be valuable. because of their skills and their knowledge, right? So that may limit the full extent of executions in the war crimes trials, okay? Now, this is a photograph of Berlin. What do you notice about all these buildings?
They're destroyed.
Okay, they're destroyed. They're pretty much uninhabitable, right? They're not totally leveled, so you actually have to tear them down, right, before you can build something back up. But they're pretty much uninhabitable. Now, the people walking along the street here, this lady you can see pretty clearly at the front, is a displaced person. And what does she have with her?
Pretty much all your stuff.
She has everything she's been able to salvage, right? That's all of her clothes, whatever she's been able to salvage from where she used to live, and she is looking for a new place to live. Okay? Now, this map shows you a lot of refugee movements. Now, let's look first at the, let's do the blue lines. So the blue lines are Germans who have been captured, were living in zones that were occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of the war. Okay? The green lines are Polish people who had been pushed eastward by the war and are maybe trying to get back to Poland or what used to be the Polish corridor within Germany. Okay? The red lines you see are people who were resettled by the International Refugee Organization. Okay? Now, what would this, or I should say not red but orange, what would this kind of represent? This line right here. Maybe Jews going to Israel as it's created. Okay? But you'll also notice where's this orange line going there?
That's to America?
To America. Okay? So you've got people being relocated in lots of different places from where they were when the war started. Okay? Now, is there a peace treaty with Germany which ends the war? No.
Just take it over.
Okay? So unlike in World War I, there is no real peace treaty. Okay? It's the victorious allies who are trying to draw up a lasting peace. Now, what started before the war even came to an end? In February of 45.
The Cold War.
The Cold War started before the war even came to an end. Okay? So, this attempt at achieving an unconditional surrender, on the one hand, defines what will end the war, which is the complete collapse of Germany and Italy. On the other hand, it means that it's a one-sided settlement. Does that make sense? The whole settlement will be by the victorious allies, and then when the US and the Soviet Union fall apart, then that settlement, a cooperative settlement, falls apart as well. which is what we call the Cold War. Okay? Now, Stalin is going to ask at Tehran and repeatedly during the war for the opening up of a second front. When did Stalin want the British and Americans to open up a second front by invading France? (1942). Did it happen? No. 1943. Did it happen? No. Not until June of 44. Okay? Let's take just a minute and let's talk about why the Soviet Union might be justifiably, or at least somewhat justifiably, concerned about security in 1945, 46. Okay? When has Russia or the Soviet Union been invaded? World War I, how did that go? Went bad. Russia had the most people killed, right? Had the most casualties in World War I. What country had the most casualties in World War II?
Russia.
Soviet Union. Okay? So both World War I and World War II have been pretty devastating to the Soviet Union. Okay? What did the Big Four create at the end of World War I to help isolate the Soviet Union? The cordon sanitaire, sanitary corridor, yes? Okay, all right. So Stalin wants to make sure at the end of World War II that he has friendly nations in Eastern Europe. How could Stalin best ensure that these nations are friendly?
By annexing them into the Soviet Union.
All right. Most directly annexing them to the Soviet Union. What if he thinks he can't get away with annexing them?
I guess establishing like troops in there, putting troops in there.
Okay, or maybe having communist governments, right? Governments run by communist parties that would be at least somewhat loyal to the Soviet Union.
I'll put last of those.
Yeah,